Chained for 7 years, a horse stands alone, forgotten, starving, and barely clinging to life. But when the man who once loved him returns, something unimaginable happens. Instead of turning away, instead of showing anger, the horse does the unthinkable, breaking free with a strength no one thought he had left. Why did the owner leave? And what happens when the past comes galloping back in ways no one could have predicted? This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and an unbreakable bond that defied time itself. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the weathered barn boards, casting a golden warmth through the dusty air. 8-year-old Lily Calloway giggled as she ran her brush through Comet's gleaming coat, the horse's dark eyes soft with contentment. Her father, Ethan, leaned against the stable door, a gentle smile playing across his face. "You're getting real good at that, sweetheart," he said, walking over to kiss her forehead. "Comet's never looked better." Lily beamed with pride. "He's the best horse ever, Daddy." She wrapped her arms around Comet's sturdy neck, and the horse lowered his head, nuzzling her shoulder. The peaceful moment shattered as gravel crunched under heavy tires outside. Through the barn's open door, they saw a police car pulling into their driveway, its presence alien and threatening against the pastoral backdrop. Ethan's smile fell. "Stay here with Comet," he said, his voice tight. But Lily followed him anyway, her small hand clutching his worn jean pocket. 2 officers stepped out of the car, their faces grim. "Ethan Calloway," one called out, "we have a warrant for your arrest." "There must be some mistake," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You're under arrest for embezzlement from Carson Valley Bank," the officer stated, pulling out handcuffs. Lily's world tilted sideways as she watched them secure the cold metal around her father's wrists. "Daddy?" Her voice cracked with fear. Ethan turned to her, his eyes fierce with love and determination. "I will come back," he promised as they led him toward the car. "And when I do, we'll be together again." Lily ran after him, tears streaming down her face, but strong hands held her back. She broke free and ran to Comet, burying her face in his mane as the police car disappeared down the long driveway. Hours later, she found herself in an unfamiliar house, the walls stark and uninviting. Her Uncle Mark's face was as cold as the modern furniture surrounding them. He barely looked at her as he showed her to a spare room. "Get some sleep," he said flatly, closing the door. Lily lay in the strange bed, her pillow growing damp with tears. The house creaked unfamiliarly, and shadows danced on walls that held no warmth. When the grandfather clock downstairs struck midnight, she couldn't take it anymore. Still in her pajamas, she slipped out of bed and crept downstairs. The back door opened silently, and she ran across the moonlit yard to the barn. Comet was there, his familiar presence a comfort in the darkness. He nickered softly as she approached. Lily threw her arms around his neck, breathing in his familiar scent of hay and horse. "He'll come back, right?" she whispered into his mane. Comet snorted softly, as if answering, and gently pressed his head against her shoulder. 3 days after Ethan's arrest, Lily sat quietly in Mark's sleek black car, her small hands pressed against the cold window. The familiar landscape of her childhood rolled past, the crooked oak tree where she'd learned to ride, the creek where she and her father had skipped stones, and finally, the fenced pasture where Comet stood watching. The horse began to run alongside the fence line, keeping pace with the car. His desperate whinnies pierced through the closed windows, each cry making Lily's heart ache more. She twisted in her seat, watching until Comet became a mere dark speck against the green pasture. then disappeared entirely around the bend. "Face forward," Mark said sharply, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Life at Mark and Jenna's house felt like living in a museum. Everything was pristine and untouchable, including their emotions. Jenna's carefully arranged smile never reached her eyes, and Mark spent his evenings behind a newspaper, barely acknowledging Lily's presence. At night, Lily would sit at the desk in her new room, carefully printing letters to her father. "Dear Daddy," she would write, "I miss you so much. When are you coming home?" She'd tell him about her days, about how much she missed Comet, about how different everything was now. Week after week, she slipped the letters into envelopes and gave them to Mark to mail. But no replies ever came. School became a blur of faces she didn't care to know. During recess, while other kids played and laughed, Lily sat alone under a tree, drawing pictures of horses in her notebook. Her teachers noticed the change. Gone was the bright-eyed girl who once raised her hand for every question, replaced by a shadow who spoke only when spoken to. Back at the farm, Mark's true nature revealed itself in cruel ways. He stood in the barn doorway, watching the ranch hands with cold eyes. "Stop wasting feed on that horse," he ordered, gesturing toward Comet. "He's useless now." The ranch hands exchanged worried glances but didn't dare argue. They secured Comet with a heavy chain in his stall, leaving him with only the occasional handful of hay. Days stretched into weeks, and the once proud horse grew thin. His coat lost its shine, his muscles wasted away, and the light in his eyes dimmed. One evening, as storm clouds gathered overhead, the wind picked up across the empty farm. The barn doors rattled in their frames, the sound echoing through the dusty space. Comet lifted his head at the noise, his ears pricking forward toward the entrance. For a moment, hope flickered in his tired eyes. But no footsteps followed. No gentle voice called his name. No small hands brought him treats or brushed his coat. No Ethan, no Lily. Just the hollow sound of wind and the growing darkness as night settled over the abandoned barn. Lily sat cross-legged on her narrow dormitory bed, the crisp envelope from her father's lawyer resting unopened in her lap. Outside her window, other students laughed and chatted as they crossed the pristine campus grounds of St. Margaret's School for Girls. Their carefree voices seemed to come from another world entirely. Her fingers traced the edge of the envelope. 7 years had passed since that day. 7 birthdays, 7 Christmases, 7 springs without her father or Comet. The return address bore an unfamiliar law firm's name, but she knew what it contained. News of her father's release. With practiced detachment, she folded the letter in half, then in quarters, until it was small enough to slip into her desk drawer. She hadn't visited him since that first year, when the sight of him in Prison Orange had been too much to bear. Why start now? Miles away, in a concrete cell barely wide enough to pace, Ethan Calloway sat on the edge of his thin mattress. The man in the small mirror above his sink barely resembled the rancher he'd once been. His dark hair grayed at the temples, and deep lines carved paths around his eyes. 7 years of fighting the system had worn him down, but never broken him. The guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor. "Calloway," he called out, "got some news from your lawyer." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he read the document. After years of appeals and new evidence, the truth had finally come to light. He was exonerated, free. But there was no joy in the moment, no urge to celebrate. Just a quiet exhale of relief, like letting go of a breath held for far too long. The world had spun on without him. His daughter had grown up in his absence, and the farm, his father's legacy, had fallen into ruin under Mark's neglect. At that very farm, in a weathered barn with holes in its roof, Comet stood in his usual spot. The chain around his neck had left permanent marks in his coat, now dull and patchy, where it had once gleamed like polished copper. His ribs protruded sharply, each breath visible through his thin frame. Years of minimal food and care had taken their toll, yet something in him refused to give up. Every morning he would turn his head toward the dirt path leading to the house, ears pricked forward in eternal vigilance. The path remained empty, worn down by rain and time rather than footsteps. Still, he watched, remembering the sound of Ethan's boots on gravel, the light patter of Lily's running feet. Dark clouds gathered overhead as afternoon faded into evening. The first drops of rain found their way through the barn's failing roof, creating steady drips that pooled on the dirt floor. Comet stood motionless as the storm intensified, cold rainwater streaming down his face and dripping from his muzzle. His eyes closed against the wind that whipped through the barn's broken boards, but he remained standing, waiting, as he had done every day for 7 years. Hours later, the yellow cab kicked up dust as it rolled to a stop in front of the Calloway farm. Ethan stepped out, his worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The cabbie didn't wait around, just collected his fare and left Ethan standing alone in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. 7 years had changed everything. The white farmhouse that had once been filled with Lily's laughter now stood like a hollow skeleton, paint peeled from the siding in long strips. Several windows gaped open, their glass long since shattered. The front porch sagged, its steps crumbling. The fields where cattle once grazed had surrendered to tall weeds and thistle. Nature had reclaimed what Mark's negligence had abandoned. Ethan's throat tightened as he took in the destruction of his family's legacy. His boots crunched on gravel as he made his way toward the barn. The sound seemed too loud in the heavy silence that blanketed the property. No birds sang, no wind stirred. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. Ethan paused, his hand on the weathered wood. He expected nothing inside but old hay and memories, remnants of a life that had been stolen from him. But then, a soft sound reached his ears, the whisper of movement, followed by a labored breath. His heart jumped into his throat as he rounded the corner into the musty darkness. There, in a shaft of dusty sunlight filtering through the broken roof, stood Comet. The proud stallion Ethan remembered was barely recognizable, ribs pressed against dull, patchy fur. The chain around his neck had rubbed the hair away, leaving raw marks behind. But those eyes, those deep brown eyes, still held the same spirit. Comet's ears pricked forward. A tremor ran through his weakened body as recognition flickered in his gaze. With a strength that seemed impossible for his deteriorated state, he suddenly lurched forward. The rusted chain snapped with a sharp crack. The horse stumbled, his legs shaking with the effort of those few steps. Then his strength gave out. He collapsed at Ethan's feet, his breath coming in ragged gas, but his eyes never left Ethan's face. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him, tears blurring his vision. His hands shook as he cradled Comet's head, feeling the bones too sharp beneath the skin. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here now." Comet released a shuddering breath. Though exhaustion clouded his eyes, there was no mistaking the trust that still lived there. 7 years of neglect hadn't broken that bond. 7 years of chains hadn't destroyed his faith that someone would return for him. Ethan shrugged off his worn denim jacket, his muscles aching from the years of prison labor. With gentle hands, he draped it over Comet's trembling body. The horse's skin felt cold to the touch, his once powerful frame now reduced to sharp angles and hollow spaces. The night air bit through Ethan's thin shirt, but he didn't move from his spot beside Comet. He couldn't. Not when every labored breath from the horse seemed so fragile, like a candle flame in the wind. After a while, Ethan tried to help Comet stand. "Come on, boy," he urged softly, attempting to support the horse's weight. But Comet's legs buckled beneath him, too weak to hold him up. The stallion's eyes rolled with panic and exhaustion. Fear gripped Ethan's heart. He needed to find something, anything, to help. He sprinted toward the farmhouse, taking the broken porch steps 2 at a time. Inside, moonlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating a scene of abandonment. Cobwebs stretched across empty picture frames. The furniture lay scattered and broken, as if someone had taken their anger out on every piece. In the kitchen, the refrigerator stood open, its shelves empty except for rust. Ethan yanked open cabinets, finding nothing but mouse droppings and dust. Then, in the back of a lower cupboard, his hand closed around something solid, an old burlap bag. He pulled it out, heart leaping when he felt the weight of oats inside. The oats were stale, but they would have to do. Ethan found a cracked bowl, filled it with water from an outdoor spigot that still worked, and mixed in handfuls of the grain until it softened. Back in the barn, he sat cross-legged beside Comet, offering small portions of the mixture. The horse's teeth worked slowly, struggling with even this simple act. Every few bites, his eyes would drift shut, exhaustion pulling at him. "Stay with me," Ethan whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He kept one hand on Comet's neck, feeling each swallow, each breath. The night grew colder, but Ethan didn't move. "You're not going anywhere. I won't let you." Hours passed like this. Ethan feeding Comet tiny handfuls, speaking soft words of encouragement, fighting his own exhaustion. The first gray light of dawn crept through the barn's broken boards, painting everything in pale shadows. Ethan noticed the change first in Comet's breathing. The ragged gas had smoothed into something steadier, more rhythmic. When he looked up from his vigil, he found Comet's eyes fixed on him. Those eyes held no accusation, no fear, only trust, pure and unwavering. It was the first sign of hope. The morning sun streamed through the barn's broken slats, casting striped shadows across Comet's thin frame. Ethan's muscles protested as he hauled bucket after bucket from the old well. But he didn't stop. With careful hands, he cleaned each of Comet's wounds, wincing at the raw patches where the chains had cut into flesh. "Easy there," he murmured as Comet flinched from a particularly tender spot. The horse's trust was a gift he wouldn't waste. After tending to Comet, Ethan walked the property, his heart sinking with each step. The damage was worse than he'd imagined. Broken fence posts littered the ground like fallen soldiers. The barn's roof had partially caved in, leaving a gaping hole where rain and snow had rotted the hay storage. Weeds choked the old vegetable garden, and the grain silo stood empty, its door hanging off rusty hinges. In town, Ethan felt the stares before he saw them. People whispered behind their hands, their eyes following him down the street. At the hardware store, the clerk's smile vanished when Ethan approached the counter. "We're not hiring," the man said before Ethan could speak. "I haven't asked about a job yet." "Don't bother. We remember what you did." The same scene played out at 3 more businesses. No one wanted to hire the man who'd stolen thousands from his company, even though he'd been proven innocent. At the farm supply store, a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Well, look who it is." Mark stood there, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place among the feed bags and tool displays. His brother's face held the same smug expression it had worn since they were kids. "I didn't think you'd come crawling back," Mark said, adjusting his gold watch. "Though I suppose you don't have anywhere else to go, do you?" "I'm here for supplies," Ethan said, keeping his voice level. "Nothing more." Mark's laugh was sharp. With what money? Everything went through me while you were away. Dad's inheritance, the farm accounts, all of it. There's nothing left. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white with restraint. The urge to swing was strong, but Comet's face flashed in his mind. He couldn't help anyone from another jail cell. Without a word, Ethan turned and walked away, Mark's taunting voice following him out the door. Back at the farm, Ethan gathered broken fence posts and loose boards. His hands were soon full of splinters as he worked to hammer the pieces together. The repairs were ugly, but they would hold. As he worked on the next section, a weak sound made him turn. There stood Comet, trembling on unsteady legs, trying to follow him across the yard. The horse's eyes held a determination that matched Ethan's own. Lily's phone buzzed against her desk, the screen lighting up with another notification. She picked it up, her fingers hovering over the familiar name that had been appearing for days now. Ethan Calloway. Her stomach tightened as she stared at it, the same way it had every time his name appeared. The city traffic hummed outside her window, a constant reminder of how far she'd come from that quiet farmhouse. She set the phone face down, trying to focus on her homework, but her hand was shaking. Another buzz, then another. Each notification felt like a small earthquake, disrupting the careful walls she'd built around herself. Lily picked up the phone again, watching as the voicemails accumulated. One after another, they appeared. Lily, I'm home. Please call me. Sweetheart, I just want to talk. I know you're angry, but please. She deleted each one without listening, just as she had done with all the others. Her thumb moved automatically now, erasing his voice before it could reach her ears. Back at the farm, Ethan sat on the floor of what used to be the living room, surrounded by debris and memories. As he cleared away broken furniture, his hand brushed against something beneath the old couch. A photograph, its edges worn but the image still clear. There they were, frozen in time. Lily, 8 years old, sitting proudly on Comet's back. Ethan stood beside them, one hand on the reins, the other on Lily's knee to keep her steady. They were all smiling. Even Comet seemed to be grinning, his ears pricked forward, his coat gleaming in the summer sun. Ethan's hands trembled as he carefully tucked the photograph into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. That night, after tending to Comet, he sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Dear Lily, I know you're deleting my calls. I understand why. But there are things you need to know. He wrote until his hand cramped, pouring 7 years of unsent letters into one envelope. Days later, Lily stood in her apartment, holding that same envelope. Her father's handwriting was exactly as she remembered it, slightly slanted, each letter carefully formed. The return address was the farms, the place she'd tried so hard to forget. Her fingers trembled as she held the envelope, feeling its weight, the slight bulge that suggested more than just paper inside. For the first time in years, she hesitated before moving toward the trash can. The letter felt heavy in her hands, like it was anchored to something deep inside her. The morning sun beat down on Ethan's worn boots as he walked into Sam's auto shop. The familiar smell of oil and metal brought back memories of afternoons spent chatting with Sam while getting his truck serviced. Now, he stood in the doorway like a stranger. Sam looked up from under the hood of a pickup truck, his expression hardening when he recognized Ethan. Didn't expect to see you around here. I need work, Sam, Ethan said quietly. Any kind of work. Sam wiped his greasy hands on a rag, studying Ethan's face. People talk, you know, about what happened. I was cleared. Everything they said about me, it wasn't true. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the shop's overhead fans. Finally, Sam sighed. Floor needs sweeping. Windows haven't been cleaned in months. Pays minimum wage. I'll take it, Ethan said quickly. Each day, Ethan scrubbed floors and windows until his hands were raw. The other mechanics avoided him, but he didn't mind. When his first paycheck came, he cashed it immediately and drove to the feed store. The fresh hay filled the back of his borrowed truck, along with bags of feed and supplements. That evening, he carefully measured out small portions for Comet, watching as the horse's eyes brightened at the sight of fresh food. "Easy now," Ethan murmured, running his hand along Comet's bony neck. "We have to take it slow." He sat with Comet for hours each night, monitoring his eating, making sure he didn't consume too much too quickly. "One step at a time, boy. We'll get there," he whispered, noticing how Comet's coat was starting to regain some of its shine. The horse's eyes, though still tired, held more life than they had in weeks. But one evening, as Ethan returned from work, he found an official-looking envelope wedged in the broken screen door. Inside was an eviction notice typed in cold, legal language. Mark was selling the land. Ethan had 60 days to pay off the accumulated debts, or everything would be lost. The porch creaked under Ethan's weight as he sat down heavily, the paper trembling in his hands. In the pasture, Comet stood near the fence, his frame stronger than before, but still far from healthy. The horse watched him with those knowing eyes, as if sensing his distress. "We're running out of time, boy," Ethan said softly, his voice carried away by the evening breeze. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cool as Ethan stepped out of the farmhouse. His boots crunched on the frost-covered grass, and his breath formed small clouds in the dim light. He paused, his heart swelling at the sight before him. There in the pasture stood Comet, his silhouette strong against the purple sky. The horse's head was held high, his stance proud despite the visible ribs that still showed through his coat. Weeks of proper care had worked wonders. The dull, lifeless look in his eyes had been replaced by a familiar spark. Ethan approached slowly, carrying an old leather saddle he'd found in the barn. It had taken hours to clean and condition it, working the stiff leather until it was supple again. Comet watched him come closer, ears pricked forward with interest. "Morning, boy," Ethan said softly, holding out his hand. Comet stretched his neck forward, nuzzling Ethan's palm. The simple gesture made Ethan's throat tight with emotion. With gentle movements, he began to brush Comet's coat. The horse stood quietly, though his muscles twitched occasionally under the curry comb. When Ethan brought out the saddle pad, Comet's ears flattened slightly. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, letting him smell the pad before placing it carefully on his back. "Remember how we used to do this?" The saddle came next. Comet stiffened as Ethan lifted it, his body remembering years of chains and neglect. Ethan froze, waiting patiently until the tension eased from Comet's frame. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he settled the saddle in place. Comet shifted his weight nervously as Ethan tightened the girth, but didn't pull away. Ethan kept talking in low, soothing tones, praising each moment of cooperation. Finally, he gathered the reins in his hand and put his foot in the stirrup. The first mounting was careful, gentle. Ethan settled into the saddle with barely any weight, ready to dismount if Comet showed signs of distress. But the horse merely turned his head, looking back at Ethan with those knowing eyes. Their first steps were wobbly, uncertain. Comet's gait was stiff, his movements showing years of disuse. Ethan didn't push, letting him find his own pace as they made their way around the overgrown property. They passed the broken fences, the weathered barn, the tall grass that had once been pasture. Slowly, with each circle, Comet's stride grew more confident. His head bobbed in a familiar rhythm, and his ears swiveled back to catch Ethan's quiet words of encouragement. The morning sun began to peek over the horizon, casting everything in soft golden light. As they turned back toward the barn, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. Pure joy. A smile spread across his face, genuine and warm. "You still got it, old boy," he said softly. Comet exhaled deeply beneath him, as if agreeing with the sentiment. The phone vibrated on Lily's desk, displaying a familiar number she'd been avoiding for weeks. Her finger hovered over the decline button, but something made her pause. Taking a deep breath, she pressed accept and held the phone to her ear without speaking. "Lily?" Her father's voice came through, uncertain and hopeful. "It's me." Her throat tightened. She gripped the phone harder, listening to his breathing on the other end. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy with 7 years of unspoken words. "Are you there?" Ethan asked softly. Lily closed her eyes, fighting the burning sensation behind them. Without a word, she ended the call, her hand shaking as she set the phone down. Later that evening, curled up in her apartment's window seat, she found herself scrolling through her photo gallery. She'd buried these pictures in a folder marked old, telling herself she'd never looked at them anymore. But here she was, finger sliding across the screen, stopping at an image she thought she'd forgotten. The photograph showed a younger version of herself, maybe 7 or 8, perched proudly on Comet's back. Her smile was wide and carefree, her small hands buried in his mane. Behind her stood Ethan, one hand on the reins, the other protectively on her leg. The setting sun had caught them just right, turning everything golden and warm. Lily's chest ached as she studied her father's face in the photo. He looked so different then. Younger, happier, without the weight of prison years etched into his features. Her phone buzzed with a message, making her jump. Mark's name appeared on the screen. The text was brief but clear. "He's after the farm. Don't let him fool you." Lily stared at the words, her uncle's voice echoing in her head with all the things he'd told her over the years. About how Ethan had chosen money over family, how he'd abandoned them both. But something felt off about those memories now, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. After a long moment, she deleted Mark's message. At her desk, she pulled open the bottom drawer where she kept things she didn't want to think about. The letter from Ethan lay there, still sealed, the edges slightly worn from the time she'd taken it out, only to put it back again. She picked it up, running her fingers along the envelope's edge. Her father's handwriting was just as she remembered, neat and slanted, with a slight curl to the "yi" in her name. The paper felt thin between her fingers, fragile with the weight of words she wasn't sure she wanted to read. For a moment, she almost broke the seal. Almost. Instead, she shook her head and shoved the letter back into the drawer, closing it firmly. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Ethan stood at the bank counter, his weathered hands gripping a stack of paperwork. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he tried to explain his situation to the loan officer. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his desperation. "Mr. Calloway, given your history, I'm afraid we can't." A familiar chuckle cut through the air. Ethan's shoulders tensed as footsteps approached from behind. "Well, well, trying to save the old place?" Mark's polished shoes clicked against the tile floor as he circled around to face Ethan. His expensive suit and carefully styled hair were a stark contrast to Ethan's worn work clothes. 60 days, brother. Tick-tock." Ethan gathered his papers, refusing to meet his brother's gaze. He'd learned in prison that some fights weren't worth having. But Mark wasn't finished. "You should tell Lily the truth about why she never heard from you." Ethan froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. The bank lobby seemed to grow quieter, the air thicker. Mark leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Ethan could hear. "I intercepted your letters. Every single one." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. His legs felt weak as memories flooded back. Countless nights spent writing by dim prison light, pouring his heart onto paper, explaining the truth, begging for forgiveness. He'd written hundreds of letters over those 7 years, each one filled with love and promises and hope. None of them had reached her. Not one. The realization made him sick. All this time, Lily had thought he'd abandoned her, forgotten her. While he'd been writing, hoping, waiting for replies that never came, she'd been growing up believing he didn't care enough to even write. Mark straightened his tie, clearly enjoying the effect of his words. He turned toward the exit, his shoes echoing in the quiet lobby. "Lily doesn't trust you," he called over his shoulder, "and she never will." Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles had turned white. The loan officer was saying something, but the words were lost in the roaring in his ears. Thunder crackled across the darkened sky as Ethan pushed against the heavy barn doors. Rain pelted his face and soaked through his jacket, but he didn't stop until the doors were properly secured. Inside, Comet shifted restlessly in his stall, his hooves scraping against the wooden floor. "Easy there, boy," Ethan murmured, checking the windows were latched tight. The old barn creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and rain. He spread fresh hay in Comet's stall, trying to make him comfortable despite the storm. Later that night, Ethan tossed and turned on his makeshift bed in the farmhouse. His dreams were filled with concrete walls and iron bars, the endless sound of keys jingling and doors slamming. In his nightmare, Lily stood before him, her back turned, walking away no matter how loud he called her name. He jolted awake, his shirt damp with sweat, heart hammering in his chest. Through the rain, he heard a different sound, the panic-stricken thud of hooves against wood. Ethan scrambled to his feet, nearly falling as he rushed to the barn. Inside, Comet was rearing up, eyes wide with fear as lightning illuminated the barn through the cracks. The old chain that had bound him for so many years lay coiled on the floor like a metal snake, catching the light with each flash. "Comet!" Ethan called out, approaching slowly with his hands raised. "Easy, boy, easy!" The horse's nostrils flared, his chest heaving with each breath. Ethan kept his voice steady despite the way his own hands shook. "It's just a storm, boy. You're free now." He moved closer, inch by inch. "No more chains. Never again." Comet's movement slowed, his ears swiveling toward Ethan's voice. With careful steps, he moved forward until his forehead pressed against Ethan's shoulder. His breathing gradually steadied, matching Ethan's own calming rhythm. The storm began to pass, its fury fading to a gentle rain. Ethan leaned against Comet's warm side, his fingers absently stroking the horse's neck. His eyes stared unfocused into the darkness, Mark's words from the bank echoing in his mind. All those letters, all those years of silence, it hadn't been Lily's choice at all. The truth sat heavy in his chest, and he knew what had to be done. He couldn't wait for phone calls or letters anymore. He had to see Lily in person. The city air felt thick and foreign in Ethan's lungs as he stood outside the prestigious private school. His calloused hands gripped the worn leather of his jacket straps, a stark contrast to the polished stone buildings that stretched toward the sky. Students streamed past him in their crisp uniforms, their chatter filling the autumn afternoon. His heart skipped when he saw her. Lily emerged from the heavy wooden doors, her dark hair pulled back neatly, white earbuds trailing from her ears. She moved with purpose, her shoulders straight, completely unaware of his presence. She looked so grown up, so different from the little girl who used to chase butterflies in the pasture. Ethan's throat felt dry as he gathered his courage. "Lily," he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. She stopped mid-step, her whole body going rigid. The world seemed to pause around them, the other students' voices fading into background noise. Ethan moved closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. "It's me, sweetheart," he said softly, the old term of endearment feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. Lily turned slowly, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. Her eyes, so like his own, were cold and distant. "Why are you here?" Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "The farm," Ethan started, his words tumbling out. "I'm trying to save it. Comet's there. He survived, Lily. He needs us. I'm fighting to rebuild everything, but I don't care." Lily cut him off sharply, already turning away. Panic rose in Ethan's chest. "Mark lied to you," he blurted out desperately. Those 4 words made her pause, her back still to him. When she finally turned to face him again, her expression was hard as stone. "You think one conversation is going to fix this?" She shook her head, her voice bitter. "You left. I moved on." Without another word, she walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the cold shadow of the school building. The evening crowd at the Silver Spoon Diner had thinned out, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and a plate of untouched meatloaf. Steam rose from his coffee cup, swirling in the harsh fluorescent light. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight as he remembered Lily's cold stare, the farm's mounting bills, and Comet's slow recovery. "Well, if it isn't Ethan Callaway!" A warm, familiar voice cut through his dark thoughts. Maria, her silver hair tucked beneath a worn waitress cap, stood beside his table with a coffee pot in hand. Her kind eyes crinkled at the corners as she topped off his cup. "You boys were always stubborn as mules, you and Mark both." Ethan's fingers tightened around the warm mug. "You know about Mark." Maria pulled up a chair, her joints creaking as she sat down. "Honey, everyone knows what he did to that farm. Letting it rot like that, spending your daddy's money like it was his to burn." She shook her head, her expression darkening. "That brother of yours is counting on you throwing in the towel. He's got buyers lined up, waiting for you to break." The coffee in Ethan's cup rippled as his hand trembled with anger. He had nothing left, no money, no allies, just a broken-down farm and a recovering horse. But the thought of Mark winning, of losing everything his father built. "Maria," he said slowly, meeting her steady gaze, "I need a favor." She leaned forward, listening intently as Ethan laid out his plan. The farm could still work. He could offer riding lessons once Comet was stronger, sell fresh eggs, maybe even board horses for city folk. He just needed people to know the Callaway farm was coming back to life. "Spread the word for me?" he asked. "Let people know we're not finished." Maria's face broke into a warm smile. "Honey, by this time tomorrow, half the county will know." When Ethan returned to the farm that evening, he made his way straight to the barn. Comet's head appeared over the stall door, ears pricked forward in greeting. Ethan reached up, running his fingers through the horse's slowly thickening mane. "We're not done yet, boy," he whispered in the quiet barn. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled Ethan from his restless sleep. He blinked, sunlight streaming through the farmhouse's dusty windows. Outside, a blue sedan had pulled up to the fence, and a woman in her 30s stepped out, helping a small boy from the back seat. Ethan straightened his worn flannel shirt and ran a hand through his hair as he walked out to meet them. The boy, no more than 7, clutched his mother's hand, his eyes wide as they took in the sprawling pasture. "Hi there," the woman called out, waving. "We saw the notice at Maria's diner about riding lessons. I'm Sarah, and this is Noah." Noah peeked out from behind his mother, his face lighting up as he spotted Comet in the distance. "Is that your horse?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's throat tightened. The last time he taught riding lessons was with Lily. He could still remember her small hands holding the reins, her delighted giggles echoing across the fields. "Would you like to meet him?" Ethan asked, pushing the memory aside. Noah nodded eagerly, and Ethan led them to where Comet grazed. The horse lifted his head, ears forward with interest. "He's so big," Noah breathed, stepping closer to his mother. Ethan knelt beside the boy. "Here," he said softly, holding out his hand palm up. "Like this. Let him come to you." Noah copied the gesture, his small hand trembling slightly. Comet approached slowly, his steps measured but steady, so different from the broken creature Ethan had found chained in the barn. The horse stretched out his neck, his velvet muzzle brushing against Noah's palm. A smile spread across Noah's face as Comet's whiskers tickled his skin. "He's soft," he whispered in wonder. Ethan watched the boy's face, seeing the same spark of joy he remembered in Lily's eyes all those years ago. Something shifted in his chest, a warmth he'd almost forgotten. "Would you like to learn how to ride?" Ethan asked. When Noah's face lit up with excitement, Ethan knew he'd found his path forward. This was how he would save the farm, not just for himself or for Lily, but for kids like Noah who needed to discover the magic of horses. As the blue sedan disappeared down the driveway an hour later, Ethan stood at the fence watching Comet. The horse stood tall in the pasture, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, no longer the broken spirit from just weeks ago. For the first time since coming home, Ethan felt a flicker of hope spark back to life. Lily sat cross-legged on her bed, her phone glowing in the dim light of her room. She mindlessly scrolled through social media, trying to distract herself from thoughts of her father's recent visit. A notification popped up. Someone had shared a post from her hometown's community page. Her thumb froze mid-scroll. Callaway Farm offering riding lessons. First horse recovered from neglect. Below the text was a photo that made her heart skip a beat. Comet stood in the sunlit pasture, his coat gleaming and muscles filling out where there had once been sharp angles. Beside him stood her father, one hand resting on the horse's neck. They both looked different, stronger. Her phone buzzed. Mark's name flashed across the screen. With a deep breath, she answered. "Have you seen what he's doing now?" Mark's voice was tight with anger. "The riding lessons." Lily kept her voice neutral, though her hand gripped the phone harder. "He's trying to drag you back into his mess. Can't you see that? First showing up at your school, now this publicity stunt." Lily stared at the photo again. "He's not asking for anything from me." "Don't fall for it, Lily." Mark's voice turned sharp. "He's using that horse to guilt trip you. It's what he does, manipulates people." But something about the image made her doubt Mark's words. The way Comet leaned into her father's touch, the natural ease between them. It didn't look staged. The horse's eyes were bright and alert, his stance relaxed. She remembered how Comet used to look at her the same way, with that mix of trust and affection. "I have to go," she told Mark, ending the call before he could protest. Her fingers hovered over the comments section of the post. The cursor blinked, waiting. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed 4 simple words. "Does Comet remember me?" For a moment, she stared at the words, her heart pounding. Then, before doubt could creep in, she pressed send. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Ethan finished spreading fresh hay in the stalls. His muscles ached from the physical labor, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from honest work. He pulled out his phone to check the time, and his heart nearly stopped. There, under the farm's post, was a comment from Lily. 5 simple words that made his hands tremble. "Does Comet remember me?" Ethan leaned against the barn door, trying to steady his breathing. Comet nickered softly from his stall, sensing his distress. The horse's dark eyes watched him with that same unwavering trust that had survived 7 years of neglect. With fingers that felt clumsy and uncertain, Ethan typed his response. "He never forgot you, not for a single day." The hours crawled by with no reply. Ethan threw himself into his work, trying not to check his phone every few minutes. He hammered loose boards back into place, swept out cobwebs, and repaired the last of the empty stalls. Comet followed him around the barn, his hooves making soft thuds against the wooden floor. The horse would stop occasionally, pressing his nose against Ethan's shoulder as if offering silent support. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Ethan settled onto the old wooden porch steps, his worn boots resting on the bottom step. The evening air was cool, carrying the sweet scent of hay and distant rain. From here, he could see the entire property, the newly repaired fences, the cleaned-out barn, the fresh paint on the stable doors. There was still so much to do. Mark's deadline loomed over everything like a dark cloud. But something had shifted today. That single comment from Lily, those 5 words, had changed something. Even if she never responded, she had reached out. For the first time since coming home, Ethan didn't feel like he was fighting this battle alone. In her room across the city, Lily sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at her father's response on the screen. "He never forgot you. Not for a single day." The words blurred as she read them again and again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came. After a long moment, she lowered her phone without responding, but she didn't delete the message either. Lily sat at her desk, her homework forgotten as she scrolled through the Callaway Farms social media page for the 5th time that day. New photos appeared regularly now. Snapshots of daily life that made her chest ache in ways she couldn't explain. There was Comet, his coat gleaming in the morning sun, nothing like the skeletal horse she remembered. His eyes were bright again, ears pricked forward as he carried a small girl around the training ring. Another photo showed Ethan fixing a fence, his sleeves rolled up, determination etched on his weathered face. The comments below were filled with encouragement from townspeople she used to know. The farm's looking better every day. And Noah can't stop talking about his riding lessons. She clicked through more pictures, each one tugging at something deep inside her. A group of kids brushing Comet's coat, the newly painted barn doors, fresh hay in the stalls. It looked real. It looked like home. Her fingers trembled as she picked up her phone. Before she could change her mind, she pulled up Ethan's number. He answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. "Lily?" His voice was soft, careful, like he was afraid she might disappear. She swallowed hard, fighting the tightness in her throat. "How do I know you're not lying?" The words came out harsher than she meant them to, but she couldn't take them back. There was a pause, and she could hear Comet nickering in the background. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was steady. "Come see for yourself." The silence stretched between them, heavy with 7 years of missed moments and unspoken words. Lily didn't agree, but she didn't refuse either. She ended the call without saying goodbye. That weekend, she stood in her room, staring at the small duffel bag on her bed. The bus ticket lay on her nightstand, its edges slightly bent from how many times she'd picked it up and put it down. Her hands shook as she zipped up the bag, still unsure if she was making the right choice. The ticket would take her back to the town she'd tried so hard to forget. Back to the farm. Back to Comet. Back to her father. She wasn't ready to forgive. Wasn't sure if she ever would be. But something inside her wanted to try. The bus wound through familiar country roads, each mile making Lily's stomach twist tighter. She pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching as 7 years of memories flickered past like an old movie. The fields looked smaller now, the trees less tall, but her heart still recognized every bend in the road. She clutched her duffel bag closer as the bus rolled into the station. The small town hadn't changed much. The same brick buildings, the same creaky benches, even the same faded advertisements on the bulletin board. Lily stepped onto the platform, her legs shaky from the long ride. She scanned the parking lot, half expecting to see Ethan's weathered face among the waiting crowd. Instead, the lot was nearly empty except for a few cars and an old blue pickup truck that had seen better days. The truck's door creaked open, and Maria, the diner owner, stepped out. Her kind face broke into a warm smile. "Come on, sweetheart. I'll take you there." Maria's voice was exactly as Lily remembered, warm and steady, like fresh bread on a cold day. Lily felt her shoulders relax slightly. The knot in her stomach loosened just a fraction. She wasn't ready to face Ethan, not yet, and somehow Maria seemed to understand that without being told. The pickup truck rumbled down familiar roads, kicking up dust behind them. Maria didn't push for conversation, letting the radio fill the silence with soft country music. As they turned onto the dirt road leading to the farm, Lily's breath caught in her throat. The land spread out before her, different yet familiar. The fences stood straight and strong now, fresh wood gleaming in the afternoon sun. The old farmhouse, though still weathered, had new windows and a solid roof. Signs of life and care were everywhere. Tools lined up by the barn, fresh hay bales stacked neatly, chickens pecking in a newly fenced yard. And then she saw him. Comet stood in the pasture, his coat catching the sunlight like polished copper. His head was held high, ears pricked forward, watching the approaching truck with intelligent eyes. He looked strong, healthy, nothing like the broken horse she'd last seen. He looked like her Comet again. The truck came to a stop, and Lily's hands trembled as she opened the door. Her feet felt heavy as they touched the ground, like they'd forgotten how to walk on this soil. But Comet hadn't forgotten her. The horse took a step forward, then another, his movements deliberate and graceful. His eyes never left hers, dark and knowing. Lily's vision blurred with tears as she whispered, "Hey, boy." Ethan stood motionless on the weathered porch, his hands gripping the railing as he watched the scene unfold before him. Lily and Comet faced each other, barely a breath apart, neither moving. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pasture, painting everything in soft golden light. Lily's hand trembled as she reached out, hovering inches from Comet's nose. The horse stood perfectly still, patient and gentle, until finally her palm made contact with his warm coat. The touch seemed to break something inside her. Tears welled in her eyes as memories flooded back. Summer afternoons spent riding bareback through open fields. Quiet moments in the barn when the world felt too big. The safety of having a friend who never judged, never left. After several long moments, Ethan walked slowly toward them, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "He waited for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily kept her eyes fixed on Comet, her hand still stroking his neck. "I don't know if I can say the same." The words came out sharp, cutting through the air between them. Ethan absorbed the blow, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I understand," he said simply, no defense, no excuses. That evening, Lily found herself in her old bedroom. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, the same faded horse posters on the walls, the same worn quilts on the bed, even her old stuffed animals lined up on the shelf. The room felt like a museum piece, preserved in time, while she had grown up and changed. She ran her fingers along the familiar dresser, feeling like a stranger in a place that should have felt like home. Through the window, movement caught her eye. In the starlit pasture, she could make out two figures, Ethan and Comet, standing together in comfortable silence. The man who never stopped fighting to come home, and the horse who never stopped believing he would. Both of them had waited for her, held on to hope when she'd given up. Lily turned away from the window and closed her eyes tight. Forgiveness felt like too big a word, too heavy a burden to carry just yet. But something had shifted inside her, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. For the first time in 7 years, she wanted to try. The morning sun filtered through Lily's bedroom window, accompanied by the steady rhythm of hammering. She stirred from sleep, drawn to the familiar sound. Through the window, she saw Ethan working on the fence, his movements determined but weary. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, yet he kept going, board after board, nail after nail. Lily made her way downstairs and onto the porch, watching him work. The question that had burned inside her for years finally found its way out. "Why didn't you try harder to reach me?" Ethan lowered his hammer, his back still turned. When he finally faced her, his eyes held a pain she hadn't expected to see. "Mark," he said quietly. Mark intercepted every letter. The world seemed to tilt beneath Lily's feet. "You wrote to me?" "Every week," Ethan's voice cracked. "Every single week for 7 years. I wrote about everything. How sorry I was. How much I missed you. How I was fighting to prove my innocence. I told you about the good days, the bad days. How much I thought about you." Lily's legs felt weak. She gripped the porch railing for support. All those years of anger, of believing she meant nothing to him, of thinking he'd chosen to forget her. It had all been built on lies. The weight of this truth crushed her chest, making it hard to breathe. She turned and ran from the house, needing to escape the suffocating revelation. Her feet carried her across the pasture, past the newly mended fences, into the open field where she used to play as a child. The sound of hooves followed her, Comet matching her pace, staying close as she tried to outrun her feelings. Finally, she stopped, her breath coming in gasps. Comet stood beside her, his presence steady and familiar. She pressed her face against his neck, letting the tears flow freely. 7 years of misdirected hatred. 7 years of pushing away the one person who had never stopped trying to reach her. From where she stood, she could see the farm stretching out before her, the broken fences that Ethan had carefully rebuilt piece by piece, the barn he'd restored from ruins, the house he'd brought back to life, just like he was trying to rebuild their relationship, one small gesture at a time.
She watched him in the distance, still working, still fighting. The father she'd convinced herself had abandoned her, who had actually never stopped trying to come home to her.
The morning mail arrived with the weight of a hammer blow. Ethan stood in the kitchen, his hands trembling as he read the official letter. Mark had escalated the legal battle. The farm's remaining debts had to be paid within 2 weeks, or everything would be lost. "This can't be legal," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. From the hallway, Lily froze, overhearing his words. She peered around the corner to see her father slump into a kitchen chair, the paper crumpling in his grip. She'd never seen him look so defeated. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping into the kitchen. Ethan tried to hide the letter, but Lily was faster. As she read the contents, her face flushed with anger. Mark wasn't just trying to take their home. He was trying to destroy any chance they had at rebuilding their life together. Without a word, Lily grabbed her jacket and car keys. "Where are you going?" Ethan called after her. "To end this," she replied, her voice steel. 20 minutes later, Lily pulled up to Mark's pristine suburban house. Her hands were steady as she marched up to his front door and knocked hard enough to make the wood rattle. Mark opened the door, his smug smile faltering when he saw her expression. "You took my father from me," Lily said, her voice shaking with rage. "You took my home. What else do you want?" Mark leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "You think a horse and a few fences can fix what's broken?" "No," Lily shot back, standing taller. "But it's a start." She turned away, leaving Mark speechless on his doorstep. The drive back to the farm cleared her head, helped her see things more clearly. For years, she'd let Mark shape her view of the world, of her father, of herself, but not anymore. When she pulled up to the farmhouse, Ethan was waiting on the porch. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. "We fight back," Lily said firmly. "Together." Maria's diner buzzed with energy as she rallied the townspeople. "The Callaway farm needs our help," she announced, her voice carrying over the breakfast crowd. "We're hosting a fundraiser this Saturday." Word spread quickly through the small town. By Saturday morning, cars lined the dirt road leading to the farm. Ethan could hardly believe his eyes as familiar faces emerged from the crowd. Old neighbors, former customers, even some of his high school friends. The farm came alive with activity. Children gathered around the fence, watching in awe as Comet trotted proudly in the paddock, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. Ethan led guided tours, showing off the repairs and sharing his vision for the future. The smell of Maria's famous barbecue filled the air as people gathered to eat and share stories. "He's ready for you," Ethan said softly to Lily, gesturing towards Comet. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Lily approached Comet, who stood patiently in the center of the ring. Ethan helped her mount, his hands steady and sure, just like when she was 8 years old. The familiar feeling of being in the saddle brought tears to her eyes. "Remember what I taught you?" Ethan asked, his hand resting on Comet's neck. Lily nodded, gathering the reins. "Keep my heels down, back straight." "That's my girl." They moved together, Lily on Comet's back, Ethan walking beside them, guiding with gentle words and occasional corrections. The crowd watched in respectful silence as father and daughter reconnected through the language they'd always shared, the quiet understanding between horse and rider. By day's end, the donation box was full. Maria counted the money twice, her smile growing wider each time. "It's enough for the first payment," she announced, with some left over for feed and repairs. As the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the last car pulled away from the farm. Ethan and Lily sat side by side on the porch steps, watching Comet graze in the pasture. No words passed between them. None were needed. The wall between them had finally begun to crumble, replaced by something stronger than before. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Callaway farm as Ethan leaned against the fence, taking in the sight before him. The past few months had transformed the land. Fresh paint gleamed on the barn, new flowers dotted the garden beds, and the paddocks bustled with activity from their growing number of boarding horses. But nothing made his heart swell more than watching Comet, now healthy and strong, grazing peacefully in the spring grass. The stallion's coat shone with renewed vigor, his eyes bright and alert. Gone were the days of chains and neglect. He stood as a testament to second chances. Lily emerged from the barn, lead rope in hand. Her steps were confident now, so different from the hesitant girl who'd first returned to the farm. She approached Comet, who lifted his head to greet her with a gentle nickering sound. She raised the lead rope, then paused. Something shifted in her expression as she looked at the piece of leather in her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered it to her side. "Come on, boy," she said softly. turning to walk across the paddock. Ethan held his breath, watching as Comet's ears pricked forward. Without hesitation, the stallion fell into step beside her, matching her pace perfectly. No rope connected them, just an invisible thread of trust that had weathered years of separation and pain. They walked the perimeter of the paddock together, Lily's hand occasionally reaching out to brush Comet's shoulder. When she stopped, he stopped. When she turned, he turned. The simple beauty of their connection brought tears to Ethan's eyes. "What do you say we go for a ride?" Ethan called out, his voice thick with emotion. "Like we used to." Lily's face lit up with a smile, the kind that reminded him of summer days long ago, when the world was simpler and trust came easily. "Race you to the tack room," she called back, already running. They saddled their horses together, working in comfortable silence. Ethan helped Lily adjust Comet's girth strap, while she double-checked his horse's bridle. The familiar routine felt like coming home. As they mounted up, the morning sun warming their backs, Ethan looked over at his daughter. She sat tall in the saddle, her hands gentle on the reins, every inch the confident rider she'd always been meant to be. Comet stood proud beneath her, his ears forward, ready for adventure. Together, they urged their horses forward, starting at an easy walk that soon broke into a gentle trot. The rhythm of hoofbeats against soft earth filled the air as they rode side by side across the open fields. The land stretched before them, green and endless, just as it had in years past. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Comet, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.